My stepfather was smiling when the attorney read my grandmother's name. That wide, practiced smile he wore at church and at dinner parties, and every time he wanted someone to believe he was a decent man. He had his hand on my mother's knee. My half-sister Bree was sitting next to him, scrolling her phone under the table like she couldn't be bothered to pretend. I noticed all of it. I always noticed everything in that family. You learn to when you're the one who doesn't quite belong. My name is June. I'm 28 years old, and for most of my life I believe that made me less loved, less considered, less worth the effort. My grandmother, Grammy Jo, everyone called her, though her real name was Josephine Claire Merritt, was the only person in my world who ever made me feel like that wasn't true. She built her company from a folding table in her garage in Decatur, Georgia. Merritt Home Goods. You've probably seen the logo, the small red house with the yellow door. She started selling handmade kitchen linens at craft fairs when she was 31 years old, freshly divorced, with 2 kids and $40 left in her checking account. By the time I was born, she had wholesale contracts with 3 regional chains. By the time I was 10, Merritt Home Goods was in every major home goods retailer in the Southeast. By the time she died, the company was valued at just under $2 billion. My stepfather Vaughn married my mother when I was 9. He was a financial consultant with good hair and a firm handshake and a very convincing way of making you feel like he already knew something you didn't. My mother loved him desperately. My half-sister Bree was born a year after the wedding, and from that point on, the shape of our family became very clear to me. There was the center of it. Mom, Vaughn, Bree, and then there was me. Adjacent, present at meals and holidays and family photos, but never quite the point. Grammy Jo saw it. She never said so directly, but she saw it. She had a way of showing up on the weekends when things were worst at home, just appearing in the driveway with sweet tea and no particular explanation and taking me to her house where I could breathe. She taught me to keep books, not accounting, actually keeping records, writing things down. She kept journals for her business going back to the early 90s, spiral notebooks filled with her handwriting, profit margins and supplier names and little notes to herself about what worked and what didn't. She told me the secret to a lasting business was the same as the secret to a lasting anything. You paid attention, and you wrote it down, and you never let anyone convince you that what you knew wasn't worth knowing. I went to college on a partial scholarship and worked 2 part-time jobs to cover the rest. Vaughn made a show of offering to help with tuition during my junior year when things got tight. I thanked him. He never actually did anything. I didn't ask again. Grammy Jo, quietly, covered the gap. I didn't find out until much later. When I graduated, I got a job as an office manager at a property management firm in Atlanta. It wasn't glamorous. I was good at it. I started taking accounting courses at night. Grammy Jo called me every Sunday and asked specific questions. Not how are you, but what did you learn this week? And what did you do about that problem with the vendor? And have you thought about where you want to be in 5 years? She took me seriously in a way that felt, sometimes, almost overwhelming, because I wasn't used to it. Vaughn, meanwhile, had started spending more time at Grammy Jo's. Helping her, he said. She was 73 and her hip had been giving her trouble, and it was natural that family would want to be involved. He brought her groceries. He took her to some of her doctor's appointments. He smiled that smile. I watched it and I felt uneasy and I told myself I was being uncharitable. Grammy Jo's health declined over the winter of the year I turned 27. Nothing sudden. She'd had a heart condition for years and it was simply progressing. She was still sharp, still herself, still calling me on Sundays. But she moved slower. She tired faster. There was a quality to her voice that hadn't been there before, something careful, like she was choosing her words with more intention than usual. In February, she asked me to come see her alone, not at a family dinner, not with everyone else around. Just me, a Tuesday morning, her kitchen table. She made coffee and we sat down, and she told me she had met with her attorney the previous week. She told me she had updated her will. She didn't tell me the contents. She said she didn't want to do that. But she looked at me steadily and said, "June, you have always been the one who paid attention. I need you to trust that I made decisions that make sense." I didn't know what to say. I told her I trusted her completely. She patted my hand. Her fingers were thin. She said, "Your stepfather is going to say things when I'm gone. I want you to remember that what I put in writing is what I mean. Don't let anyone explain it away for you." I drove home and sat in my car in the parking garage for 10 minutes before I could make myself go inside. She died in April, a Tuesday, quietly, at home, which was what she wanted. The funeral was small. Grammy Joe had specifically requested no fuss. Afterward, her attorney, a measured, careful man named Mr. Aldrich, who had worked with her for over 20 years, contacted each of us about the reading of the will. I remember what Vaughn was wearing that day. A charcoal blazer, his good watch. He'd had a haircut recently. He held my mother's hand and guided her into the conference room like he was escorting her somewhere important, somewhere he already knew the layout of. Bree sat beside him in a cream blouse, her hair down. She was 20 years old and beautiful and had never once in her life thought about where money came from. I say that not with cruelty, but with a kind of sad accuracy. No one had ever made her think about it. I sat across the table. I had worn my good blazer too. I don't know why that felt important. Mr. Aldrich read the will clearly and without editorializing. Grammy Joe had left personal items, jewelry, furniture, the contents of her kitchen, distributed among various family members. She had left a sum to her church and the smaller sum to a literacy nonprofit she'd supported for years. She left Bree a generous cash amount. And she left me the company. Controlling interest in Merit Home Goods, the house, the business accounts. A note, not read aloud, passed to me directly in a sealed envelope that Mr. Aldrich said she had prepared separately. The room was very quiet. I looked up from the papers in front of me and Vaughn's smile was completely gone. He had a way of going very still when things didn't go the way he expected. He went very still. My mother's hand covered her mouth. Bree finally looked up from her phone. Vaughn recovered first. He said slowly that there must be some kind of arrangement that needed to be worked through. He said Grammy Joe hadn't fully understood, toward the end, the complexity of the business. He said he had been helping her manage things these past months, and she had relied on him heavily, and he wasn't sure she had been in the best position to make these kinds of decisions unassisted. Mr. Aldrich looked at him and said that Mrs. Merritt had been fully competent at the time of signing, had been evaluated by her physician, and that the documentation was thorough and clear. Vaughn said he'd need to speak with his own attorney. Mr. Aldrich said that was entirely his right. I said nothing. I held the envelope in my lap and I thought about Grammy Joe's voice in her kitchen telling me to remember what she put in writing. I opened the envelope that night, alone in my apartment. She had written it by hand, 3 pages of her familiar script, the same handwriting from those old spiral notebooks. She said she had watched me for 28 years. She said she had watched the way I worked without recognition. She said she had watched Ron ingratiate himself with everyone in her life, and she had let him do it because she needed the help and because refusing it outright would have caused my mother pain. But she said she had never once been confused about what she was watching. She said she had called her attorney the same week Vaughn first suggested, casually, over Sunday dinner, that perhaps she should put the business in a trust that the whole family could benefit from. She said she knew exactly what she was doing. She ended the letter with, "You were always the point, June. I should have said it more plainly while I was alive." Consider this me saying it now. I sat on my bathroom floor and cried for a long time. The next 3 weeks were the worst I'd experienced since she died. Vaughn moved fast. He got an attorney, and that attorney sent a letter to Mr. Aldrich contesting the will on the grounds of undue influence and diminished capacity, the same grounds he had tried to introduce in the room the day of the reading. He called me directly once, early on a Saturday morning, and said he hoped we could handle this like adults and like family, and that he was sure Grammy Joe would have wanted everyone taken care of. I said I thought I understood what Grammy Joe wanted. He said I was young and I didn't have business experience, and the company needed stable leadership, and he was only thinking about protecting what she had built. I said thank you for your concern, and I ended the call. My mother left a voicemail that same week. Her voice was careful, precise, the way it got when Vaughn had helped her prepare what she wanted to say. She said she knew this was a difficult time and she didn't want any conflict, but she thought it was worth sitting down and talking about a path forward that worked for everyone. She said Grammy Joe had been like a mother to her too, and she was grieving and she hoped I could remember that. I listened to it 4 times. I thought about all the Tuesday nights I had sat at that dinner table feeling like a guest in my own house. I thought about Vaughn offering to pay tuition and never doing it. I thought about Grammy Joe covering the gap without telling me, quietly, because that was who she was. I called Mr. Aldrich. He had anticipated this. Grammy Joe had apparently anticipated it too. Her will included a no-contest clause. Any beneficiary who challenged the will in court and lost would forfeit their own inheritance entirely. Bree's cash inheritance, in other words, was contingent on not pursuing legal action. Mr. Aldrich explained this to Vaughn's attorney in a letter. He also enclosed, at Grammy Joe's instruction, a copy of the physician evaluation from 3 weeks before the signing, and a signed letter from Grammy Joe's accountant confirming that she had been actively reviewing business financials up to 10 days before the will was executed. Vaughn's attorney went quiet. Then Vaughn tried something else. I found out through the company's CFO, a woman named Miss Price who had worked with Grammy Joe for 11 years and had called to offer her condolences and her continued support in the week after the reading. Ms. Price told me carefully that she had received a call from Vaughn presenting himself as a representative of the estate, asking about the process for transferring signature authority on the business accounts. He had no authority to do that. He had never had authority to do that. I called Mr. Aldrich again. He contacted the bank directly. A formal letter went to Vaughn and his attorney outlining that any further attempt to access, transfer, or represent control over the business assets would constitute fraud and would be referred to law enforcement. Vaughn went quiet after that. I had never been involved in anything legal before. I kept expecting to feel victorious, or righteous, or at least relieved. Mostly I felt exhausted and a little hollowed out. I was also, underneath all of it, absolutely terrified. I had never run a company. I had taken accounting courses. I had managed an office. I knew how to read a balance sheet, but that is not the same thing as understanding wholesale contracts and distribution logistics and a payroll of 63 employees. Ms. Price was patient with me. She said Grammy Joe had told her, about a year before she died, that when the time came she would want to make sure I had everything I needed to learn. She said Grammy Joe had left detailed notes, actual printed binders, organized by department, the same careful documentation she had always kept, that she had put in the office safe, notes about each key employee, notes about the contracts, notes about problems she had been watching and decisions she had been putting off. I went to the office for the first time 3 weeks after the reading. It was a Tuesday. I noticed that and I thought Grammy Joe would have found it appropriate. The staff was kind. Some of them had known her for 15 or 20 years, and they had the look of people who were genuinely grieving and also genuinely uncertain. I told them I was not coming in to make immediate changes. I was coming in to listen and to learn. I told them I had been trained by the best person I had ever known, and that I intended to honor what she built, and I meant every word of it. The will contest was officially withdrawn 2 months later. Vaughn's attorney filed the dismissal without comment. My mother called me that same week, her own voice this time, no careful preparation, and said she was sorry. She said she knew she had let things go on too long. She said she didn't know how to explain it except that she had let someone else become the center of things, and she had lost track of herself, and she was sorry. I didn't tell her it was fine, because it wasn't entirely. But I told her I loved her because I did. We agreed to have dinner the following week, just us, no Vaughn. It was the first time we'd done that in years. Bree texted me a week after that, just 3 words. I'm sorry too. I don't know what the future of that looks like. Some things are too old and too shaped to become something else overnight. But I wrote it down, like Grammy Joe taught me, because it felt like something worth recording. I took possession of the house in June. The movers came on a Thursday and I stood in Grammy Joe's kitchen while they carried boxes in from the truck. And I thought about all the mornings I had sat at that table while she made coffee and asked me what I had learned that week. The red house with the yellow door and the company logo was based on a real house, a small colonial in Decatur where she had rented a room when she was first starting out. She had told me that once, years ago. She said she kept it in the logo so she would never forget what starting from nothing actually felt like. I kept it too. I wasn't about to change it. I'm still learning. Some days I am completely overwhelmed and I sit in her office. My office, though that still sounds wrong, and I open one of her binders and I read her handwriting and I think about what she would say. She would probably tell me to stop being sentimental and write down what I'm learning. So I do. Spiral notebooks, same as hers. The margins are getting full. She was right that I was always paying attention. She was right that it would matter. I think about her every Tuesday, which is most weeks more than once, and I hope, she would look at what I'm doing and nod. Not because it's perfect, just because it's honest and it's real, and it came from the place she pointed me toward all those years ago when she pulled into the driveway with sweet tea and no explanation and took me somewhere I could breathe. That was the inheritance, really. The company, the house, the accounts, those were the form of it. But the thing she actually gave me started a long time before she wrote any of it down. I know that now, and I wrote it down too. There's a spiral notebook on my desk right now. The cover is a little bent from being carried around in my bag, and the margins are getting crowded just like hers always were. I didn't plan for that to be the thing that makes me feel closest to her, but it is. I've thought a lot about why things turned out the way they did. Not in a bitter way. I'm past that, mostly, but in the way you think about a pattern once you can finally see the whole shape of it. Grammy Jo didn't leave me the company because I was her granddaughter. She left it to me because for 28 years she watched me pay attention, stay honest, and keep going even when nobody was watching. Those three things, I think, are really the whole story. The honesty part is what people underestimate. Vaughn was smart, he was organized, he was charming, he knew how to present himself. But he was performing. He brought groceries and attended appointments and smiled at the right moments, and underneath all of it he was calculating. Grammy Jo saw through it not because she was suspicious by nature, but because she had spent a lifetime learning the difference between someone who does the right thing and someone who does the visible thing. That distinction matters more than most people realize. She called her attorney the same week he first suggested the family trust. She didn't say anything to him, she just quietly took care of what needed to be taken care of. That's what integrity actually looks like. Not the announcement of it, but the quiet, consistent practice of it, especially when it costs you something. The intelligence part, for me, wasn't about being the smartest person in the room. It was about being a student of my own life. Grammy Jo taught me that. She kept records not because she had to, but because she believed that what you pay attention to is what you understand. And what you understand is what you can actually protect. When everything fell apart after she died, I wasn't blindsided by the business. I was overwhelmed, yes, but I had been trained to learn. I had been trained to ask questions, to read documents carefully, to sit with Miss Price and say, "Tell me how this works," and mean it. That habit, built quietly over years, turned out to be the thing that saved me. And then there's the part that nobody talks about as much. The persistence of just continuing. There were weeks after the will reading that I didn't know how I was going to walk into that office and face another day of learning what I didn't know while also defending my right to be there at all. Vaughn didn't give up easily, neither did the doubt inside my own head. But Grammy Jo had shown me what it looked like to start with $40 and a folding table and just keep going, day after day without requiring anyone to notice. I had that example. On the hard days, I held on to it. Causes produce effects. What Vaughn planted, the performance, the calculation, the slow campaign to position himself, produced exactly the outcome you'd expect when it met someone who had spent decades building something real. And what Grammy Jo planted in me, all those Sunday phone calls and Tuesday mornings and spiral notebooks, produced something too. I'm still finding out what that something is, but I'm writing it down.